Okay, so here is part 2 of Oversimplified World War II. Thank you all very much for watching the first part. Link will be in the description, by the way, or it'll be maybe somewhere over here. I don't know. I haven't quite figured that out yet. But here's part 2 of World War II Oversimplified. I really, really liked the first one. I think you guys enjoyed it as well. I think it's like the fastest, like most watched video in a certain time period on the channel so far. I think it did slightly better than the How Canada Will Fall by What If Alt History. Check out that video as well. And yeah, so without further ado, let's get right into it. By the way, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that, blah, blah, blah. Typical YouTube banter. And any comments, let me know. I'd love to talk to you guys more in the comments about this. Have maybe some debates on something. Any questions, please put it all there. So let's get right into it. That didn't work. That
So
worked.
what else is happening? Well, when I said Britain was all alone, that wasn't entirely true. Many Commonwealth nations and other Allied colonies had joined the war in Britain's support.
Are you erasing us? Like, are we being erased right now? What the fuck?
They would play a key role throughout
There we go. I was about to say, man, what is
the war.
What is this oversimplified
Italian
erasing
campaigns.
Canadians?
On the Axis side, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the defensive tripartite pact, bringing their military alliance even closer together. The Soviet Union's war against Finland should have been an easy victory, but it became a humiliating struggle, and their military ineptitude was put on full display. In the end,
Yeah, so that was actually one of the big reasons too why Hitler thought that the Soviet Union would come crashing down. Right? There's that famous quote that the Soviet Union is a rotten structure, and all we need to do is kick the door in, and the whole structure will come collapsing down. This whole Winter War is actually really. I'd actually like to react to a Winter War video. Because it's really, really fascinating what the Finns did, how they resisted the Soviets, some of the tactics they had used. Really, really cool, and a lot of sisu, I think that's the right word, the right Finnish word, that was put on display for this war. So, yeah, really, really big failure by the Soviet Union to try and tackle the mini country of Finland, so to say. But Finland did end up conceding almost 30% of their territory. So I guess in the end it was a victory in a way.
and they did force the Finns to sue for peace. Then, they continued their honorable campaign of pushing around much smaller countries.
Oh, and by the way, that's larger Finland is called Greater Finland. I don't know if there's any movements in Finland to try to restore Greater Finland modernly, but hey. Oh, I did something wrong. Oh no, I'm so sorry. Okay.
By annexing the Baltic states and part of northern Romania. France's colonies in equatorial Africa were like, heck no, we aren't going to join the Germans, and they all pledged their allegiance to free France, except for Gabon, which had to be taken by military force. The Allies also tried to capture the strategic port of Dakar, but that ended in failure. Mussolini had seen Hitler's successes, and he thought now it was Italy's time to shine, so he tried to take British Somaliland, and that went pretty well. Then he tried to take Egypt, and that went less well.
That did not go as well, and this is your classic Africa war in Hoi 4. Yep. So obviously, right, you want to put troops back here, right? You want to make sure that you fall back to El Element, and yeah, so there you go. That's a Hoi 4 reference for you.
Then he tried to take Greece, and that went really badly.
That went really badly. And I remember it was one time I heard it was argued
Then he tried to
that, and I don't know if this is like actually true, but that if Greece was not invaded by the Italians and Germany had not sent their support, they would have had more troops that would have been able to be put on Barbarossa in June of 1941. And, you know, whether that, and it also delayed their invasion as well by a few weeks, I think by 2 weeks. And I think it was Hitler himself in his Table Talks book, which is a very interesting book, that he said, this was the reason why it failed, which is obviously a little ridiculous and a little one-sided to saying, oh, well, it was only because we didn't attack 2 weeks late. But yeah, the invasion of Greece was a complete failure for the Italians, albeit they did eventually push back with German help. So
Greece, and that went really badly. Churchill began referring to Italy as Europe's soft underbelly. He began favoring a military campaign from the south and started sending British troops to Greece. All of this had Hitler pretty concerned, and he moved to protect his southern flank. He had been getting friendly with Hungary and twisted their arm into signing the Tripartite Pact and joining the Axis Pact.
fascinating.
Romania was also eager to join.
Fascinating story about that too, about how Horthy was practically tricked into signing it. I'm going to get the details on this wrong, unfortunately, but it's a really fascinating story how the Germans, they basically staged, I can't remember if it was an attack or it was an uprising or something like this, but they staged something against the Hungarian the Hungarian government to really twist their arm, really twist their arm into signing and joining the Axis. I'd highly recommend you look it up. I'm sorry I don't remember it off the top of my head, but that was detailed in that book by Ian Kershaw. So that was really conniving by the Germans. Shocking. Nazis being conniving. I know.
For protection against the Soviet Union. The Tripartite Pact was designed to prevent any other countries from deciding to join the Allies, specifically Britain's old ally, the pesky United States of America. When war first broke out, American public opinion was strongly against joining in. In 1940, there was an election. The Republican candidate said, "I will not send any young Americans to die in Europe," and sitting President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "I will also not send any young Americans to die in Europe. Unless I have to, then I might." And Roosevelt won. Churchill asked him to join the war, but Roosevelt said, "No can do, Winston, but you know what? Here, have some weapons." America
and a lot of weapons. Like the amount of logistics that was sent to the Allied nations from the United States is if you look at the figures, it's incredibly significant how much weapons manufacturing, steel, and other materials for war was sent to these countries. It really did help the war effort.
began supplying the Allies with food and munitions. But there was one problem.
Food as well.
German U-boats were sinking thousands of Allied supply ships in the Atlantic, including American ones. If the Germans could sever Britain's supply line, the UK would starve. Throughout the war, the Allies had to come up with better technology to fight the U-boats. Improved radar, aircraft with longer range, better weaponry and convoy tactics. At one point, a man even called a meeting and said, "Pykrete, you take some wood, you take some ice, you put them together, you get pykrete." And then he pulled out a gun and shot some wood and it shattered. And then he shot some pykrete and the bullet ricocheted off it and hit someone else in the conference room. Then they tried to make a pykrete aircraft carrier, but that idea was scrapped because that's a really dumb idea. In the end, Alan...
Wow. Can you imagine? You're just some poor government minister, like some poor backbencher that's sitting in on this meeting. And the guy next to you gets shot.
Alan Turing and his team of codebreakers cracked Germany's
Wow, okay, I've never heard
and
that
the
story
U-boats
before.
gradually became less and less of a threat. Back in Africa, Britain decided to push Italy out of Egypt.
God.
Hey,
Wow.
that was pretty easy. So they kept going. Hitler realized he was
this is when you need to do Fortress Italy, right? You need to start building more infantry. So.
going to have to finally step in and do something. He went to Bulgaria and Yugoslavia and said, "Hey, I'm going to move troops through you to get to Greece. So either join us or, be invaded." Bulgaria opted to join them. Yugoslavia opted to be invaded. Then Greece finally fell to the joint German-Italian invasion. The British had moved troops from North Africa to fight in Greece, which helped Rommel and his tank divisions push the British back to Egypt. And they could have kept going, but a small, mostly Australian force held out under siege for 8 months in Tobruk, denying the Germans a strategic port city and disrupting their supply line. Despite having some success in the Middle East, the British didn't seem like any real threat for now. Hey, Soviet Union, look out.
Yes.
With 3 million troops, Hitler launched the largest ground invasion in history, and Stalin was far from ready. Both Churchill and Roosevelt had warned him of an impending attack, but he dug his head in the sand, and the Soviets didn't stand a chance. Germany made...
Yeah, and just the amount of intelligence that was provided to Stalin, both from MI5, don't remember off the top of my head, and the OSS, right, which is now known as the CIA, but he didn't believe any of it. He genuinely took Hitler on his word. And what's a fascinating idea is that if the Germans had not have invaded the Soviets, would the Soviets have invaded the Germans? That to me is a very interesting question. Maybe something in like 1942, 1943, right? That alliance was already very fragile, right? The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. However, how far would the Soviets have gone? And maybe that's a YouTube video in and of itself is, what if the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was not broken? What then might have happened? Maybe that's a what if Altis video. I don't know. Maybe we'll get to that. Put it in the comments if you know one of these videos.
Made staggering progress, with huge encircling movements capturing mind-boggling numbers of Russian troops.
Yeah,
a 250,000 at Bialystok, Minsk, 300,000 at Smolensk, nearly 700,000 at Kiev, and again at Vyazma and Bryansk. Leningrad was...
I mean, that's like the entire population of Toronto encircled in a few months.
Put under a siege that would last an insufferable 4 years. The invasion of Russia had been Hitler's main ideological goal from the beginning, and his hatred for the ethnic peoples there was now unleashed in all its fury. The Eastern Front of the Second World War was brutal for all that endured it. The Germans were now inside of Moscow, and that's it. It's all over. But then it happened. It got cold. Stupid cold. Hitler had hoped the Soviets would give up before winter, but they kept fighting. His commanders came to him and said, "Can we please dig in for the winter and wait until spring?" "No. Keep going." "But oil is literally freezing inside our vehicles." "That's fine. Keep going." "We're having to leave the corpses of our frozen horses by the side of the road so we can still find our way in the snowdrift." "Perfectly normal. Keep going." Hitler hadn't given his millions
right? And
of men winter clothing and supplies because he thought he really should have won by now. Then, Stalin called in troops from the Siberian front, specially trained to fight in the extreme cold, and the Germans were no match. They were...
And this is one interesting point, too. I remember reading an article a few years back that said, if they had taken Moscow, right, it might not have changed anything, right? There's always this assumption, I think Napoleon had this assumption as well, of that if you capitulate the capital city, then the whole country falls, right? But as he stated here, right, Stalin brought in Siberian troops, which I actually hadn't known about that, that were specially designed to fight in winter, right? And who's to say that they wouldn't have just pushed, right? They would have just pushed more into the Urals, right? The government might have pushed more into the Urals. And so to think that, if they just had captured Moscow, that would have been the end. I don't know. I'm not so certain about this. I think Operation Barbarossa was doomed from the start, right? I don't see, again, I'm not a historian. However, I do read occasionally and watch YouTube videos, and that doesn't count. But I think that from what I've read is that the general historical consensus is that Operation Barbarossa was doomed to fail from the beginning. It was an unwinnable operation. So maybe there's maybe some would disagree, but at least from what I've read, the general consensus is that. And it just basically comes down to the boring parts of war, which is supply and weather, which has got to be the least sexiest things about military operations, but they're just so critical and they are so crucial to winning and fighting. And they were practically, doomed from the start, to say.
Now being pushed back, they had no choice but to dig in and wait for winter to end. Germany's victories were staggering, and Japan was eager not to miss.
And I also think it was a particularly cold winter in 1941, like a very, very cold, as he said, stupidly cold. I think it was out of the norm how cold it was.
It's the victory bus. Their war in China had come to a standstill, but they wanted to keep expanding their sphere of influence and getting those sweet, sweet raw materials. They began making plans to expand southward, but there was a problem. Southeast Asia was heavily colonized by America and Great Britain. It was also full of ocean. Ocean meant naval combat, and there was no way the Japanese Navy could stand up to the US and the UK.
Yep.
So they thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could destroy their navies before we begin our conquest? And so it was. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise air raid on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and inflicted a huge amount of damage. They also attacked British colonies in Southeast Asia. Roosevelt had no choice but to declare war on Japan, and so did Churchill. Hitler then declared war on America, even though he totally didn't have to. The attack...
So that's one thing that I never was quite clear on, was why exactly. And this is just something where my knowledge is lacking, but I don't ever remember reading a reason why he did that outside of the Tripartite Pact. And maybe that's the reason in and of itself, but if I remember correctly, he didn't have to. And would the United States have gotten involved in Europe anyways? Most likely. But yeah, maybe someone can provide me an explanation for that, of why specifically he did declare war, because it seems exactly that, like really shooting himself in the foot for the second time, right? So, well, multiple times at this point, but at least for the video, the second time.
Attack on Pearl Harbor seemed like a big Japanese victory, but they didn't attack any of the naval repair yards, fuel storage tanks, or the submarine base, meaning the Pacific Fleet would be up and running again pretty soon. In the meantime, though,
yes, but it was just meant to be a quick strike to damage them enough so they could quickly get the resources, right? It was about time, because Japan knew they would never, ever win against the United States. Ever. Just not possible, right? And even the Japanese leadership knew this, right? So it was about a really quick strike and then to have the time to build up the resources, right? And either America could come to terms or it's something along these lines. But unfortunately, sorry, should not say that. Fortunately, it was a failure.
their conquest. They took Guam, the Gilbert Islands, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. They forced Thailand to join them so they could march their troops through to Malaya. They swept through Singapore, North Borneo, the East Indies, New Guinea, the Solomons, and they were now threatening northern Australia and the borders of India. Japan's victory had been as staggering as the Germans, and it reinforced the Japanese idea that this was a divine war which they were destined to win. But their victories had been based on speed, not power.
It's definitely
and
not
power
Italy driving
would eventually catch up with them.
Yes.
For now, though, in all occupied nations, the people suffered. Persecution, forced labor, harsh punishments for any who spoke out against their occupiers. In Europe, the Nazis were rounding up ethnic minorities and other unwanted groups and individuals. In particular, millions of Jewish people would suffer through the terrible events of the Holocaust. Brave resistance movements rose up in defiance of their invaders, while the people held out for hope. And hope was coming. Winter was over, and Hitler...
And not only Jews either, but also Roma, people that were homosexuals, people that were formerly socialists, communists, anyone, right, who was against the state and was against the occupation in some sort of manner, or even those that were just innocent bystanders, right, for retribution from partisans or something like this were killed. And it really was just a lot of unnecessary bloodshed. So I'm glad that he took the time to actually mention the human aspect, because sometimes it can be too much about tactics and military and tanks and logistics, but the human toll, right? The effect that this had on humanity and on people's lives is far greater than tank technology or naval warfare or something like this.
Could continue his push eastward, but this time he switched up his strategy. He wanted to focus on the south. His plan was to cut off the Russian armies in the Caucasus, an area full of oil, and then invade the Caucasus and take all the oil. His forces moved across the north with ease, and Hitler got cocky. He rerouted the 4th Panzer Army south early, leaving the 6th Army to complete the encircling movement alone. To do so, the 6th Army had to reach and take the key Soviet city of Stalingrad. The Russians defended it fiercely, and Stalingrad saw some of the harshest fighting of the entire war. The Soviets held up the German advance for 5 months as they battled in the war-torn city, which bought them valuable time. When the
There's a fascinating story, too, about how a train station in Stalingrad switched hands 9 times in a single day. I think it was 9 or 7 times or something around this. I don't exactly remember perfectly. But yeah, just the amount of fierce urban fighting that happened in Stalingrad. There's a couple really great movies about it, and there's tons of documentaries on Stalingrad. I'd really highly recommend you check them out. Both Stalingrad and the siege of Leningrad as well.
The Germans had first launched their invasion a year earlier. The Soviets had moved their...
That would be a perfect time to go and from our sponsor and then talk about some historical documentary that sponsored this video.
Factories to the east. Those factories had been building a butt-ton of tanks and aircraft and getting the Soviet army up to scratch. Now, it was ready. Stalin gathered his new and improved forces around the city, and in an attack that resembled Hitler's own encirclement tactics, they began surrounding the 6th Army. Hitler's commanders came to him and said, "Hey, maybe we should retreat." But Hitler said, no, you stay. The entire 6th Army was trapped and had to surrender, with complete air superiority.
And not only that, the 6th Army was actually trapped there for months, right? And there's a fascinating video from Mark Felton History Productions, or maybe it's just Mark Felton History, I don't remember, on YouTube about the remnants of the Stalingrad invasion and how some of them were living, in basements, right? Just moving from basement to basement, living underground in the sewers, right? That some of them were intent on evading capture, and they held out until the absolute end, living in, the most survivalist, brutal ways of having to survive. And it's really quite fascinating to see how long they held out. I mean, they held out for nearly 3 months, right, after the city was entirely encircled and the majority of troops had surrendered. So I'd highly recommend checking out his video on that.
The Soviets started pushing westward. For Stalin, it was a resounding victory. For Hitler, an absolute catastrophe.
Yes.
Things also weren't looking too good for Hitler elsewhere.
And
With
this was
America now
really
at
the
war,
turning
Allied
point of the
bombing over
war,
German
was
cities reached
Stalingrad, in my
devastating
opinion.
levels. In
And,
Africa, the
from
British had
some
pushed
other
Rommel back
historical
again,
consensus
then
as
they
well.
were pushed back again, and finally, after a decisive battle at El Alamein, and with American and British troops arriving in the west, the Germans and Italians were squeezed
Operation
out of
Torch.
Africa. Japan was also already seeing its rapid success being turned around. They attempted to take the island of Midway, but the US Navy
the
was
Battle of
ready for the
Midway,
attack,
yes.
and they sank Japan's carriers. Actually, they sank a lot of them. It was a battle from which the Japanese Navy would never recover. British, Indian, and Chinese troops held the line in the harsh jungle terrain of Burma, and the Japanese suffered losses in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. They began to realize they were not invincible. With the Axis out of Africa, the Allies had to decide their next move. Churchill still wanted to attack from the south, while the Americans preferred a full sea invasion in northern France. All right, said the Americans.
Let's do
it your
both.
way. Allied forces successfully landed in Sicily and began
Yes.
moving north. They also carried out bombing raids over Rome. The thing was, many of the people in Sicily had relatives living in America, and they greeted the American troops quite warmly. With the war reaching home territory, most Italians just weren't that into it, and Mussolini was suddenly very unpopular. He was voted out by his own fascist Grand Council and was toppled from power. Italy immediately began negotiations for surrender. Hitler wasn't surprised and had already sent reinforcements southward. In an operation he ironically called Operation Axis, German troops quickly disarmed Italian troops in the north. The Allies continued fighting the Germans up through Italy, but then winter set in, meaning mud, and everything slowed to a halt. All right, said the Americans, let's do it our way as well. Germany had made it so...
And since he didn't touch on this, he was not only toppled from power, he was first he was captured, then he was saved by the Germans, and then he was put in charge of the northern puppet state when Italy sort of broke in half, if you will. And then he was captured by partisans and hung from shot and then hung from a gas station. So it was slightly more than just toppled from power, but
a lot of enemies and millions of...
And that was one of the things that Wikipedia's shot because I'm lazy. That was one of the things that Hitler did not want to happen to him. So when he eventually committed suicide, right, the murderer of Hitler himself, that's why he requested that his bodies were burned immediately.
Allied troops had been gathering in England as factories worked around the clock producing the war material needed for a super crazy massive the likes of which the world has never seen before invasion of Europe. The Germans knew an Allied invasion would come, but
will
they
likely maybe
thanks to Allied deception tactics,
not
they
see
thought
in
there
a
was pretty
very
good
long
chance it would
time.
come at Calais. But the Allies were really going to land in Normandy because it was less fortified and the beaches were nicer. Under the careful planning of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion that had been long in the making was just about ready to go. Just one thing was preventing the launch: the British weather. For a short while, everyone sat around waiting for a decent day, and then it came. On the night of June 5th, over 1,000 bombers took off and raided coastline defenses, while paratroopers were dropped inland in a bit of a chaotic operation, tasked with sabotaging defenses and capturing key bridges to stop any German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Early the next morning, the barrage came, as Allied ships fired a huge number of shells at the German fortifications, and then the landings. The Americans at Utah and Omaha, the British at Golden Sword, and the Canadians at Juneau. It was a tremendous struggle with a great...
And Juneau Beach was the quickest captured, which was captured by Canadian troops. And I had the opportunity to go there when I was younger in grade 10. I did a Europe trip there, and to see Juneau Beach, and I mean it is exactly as it was. It really is quite something to sort of stand on the sand where Canadians, my fellow countrymen, so to say, had perished and lost their lives and fought against this sort of great evil in Europe. So it really is quite something. If you ever get the opportunity to visit any of the 5 beaches, I'd highly recommend it there in France.
Loss of life, particularly.
Yeah, look at this photo, right? Look at the amount of logistics that is in this. How many ships are in this photo, right? I mean, to think about the amount of supplies, planning, coordination that had to go into this, I mean, it's unreal. And so I talked about this in part 1, but to think that this could have been done with Sea Lion, right? It's just, I don't think it would have ever been possible.
But the Allied troops captured the beaches and the landings were a success. Then they began their movements inland. They took the port of Cherbourg and the city of Caen. The Americans moved...
And what's shocking too is that they thought that the losses were going to be so much heavier. And here's a fascinating little story, is that the Purple Hearts that were, the Purple Heart, the American Purple Heart, a lot of them were created? Yeah, created. I'll use the word created. Were created before the D-Day landings because the Americans were expecting the casualties to be so high, right? And some of the Purple Hearts that are still awarded out to this day were originally created for D-Day, right? So if anyone, so for some of the Purple Hearts that were given out in Afghanistan and Iraq, some of them were created before D-Day because they had so many of them. So the D-Day invasions really were an overwhelming success that I think even shocked the Allied leaders with how successful they truly were.
South to capture Brittany. Then, in a massive disaster for the Germans, British and Canadian troops from the north and Americans from the south trapped the German 7th Army in a near wipeout encircling movement. In August, Allied troops landed in the south of France to little resistance. On one beach, all they found was a Frenchman handing out champagne. Paris was liberated, and the Germans were pushed out of France.
I'd love to know that story more.
Belgium. In the Far East, the Allies started to push the Japanese out of Burma. As the Americans launched a two-pronged offensive handing out champagne, Paris was liberated, and the Germans were pushed out of France.
I hit J instead of K. K is the pause button.
The Allies started to push the Japanese
What
out
an
of Burma.
amateur.
As the Americans...
Anyways, what I wanted to say is that's where my grandfather was, by the way. He was in Burma with the British Air Force.
Launched a two-pronged offensive in the Pacific. In the south, General MacArthur led the push to liberate the Philippines, while General Nimitz oversaw the brutal island-hopping campaign. American forces had to make hard-fought landing after hard-fought landing on fiercely defended small islands as
incredibly
they moved
well
steadily
defended
towards the Japanese mainland. The Japanese believed that the greatest thing a person could do was to die in battle, and the most dishonorable act was to surrender. As a result, they fought ferociously to the very end. And the closer the Americans got to the mainland, the more ferocious the resistance became. In February 1945, the Americans captured the island of Iwo Jima, and an intense firebombing campaign of Japan's wooden cities began. The Allies suffered...
And what's crazy, too, is a lot of people talk about the casualties that the bomb brought, right? The atomic bomb. But the casualties that came from firebombing, right, were, I'm pretty sure, were far outweighed the casualties that came from the nuclear bomb. I mean, there were some firebombing raids that killed tens, if not hundreds of thousands of civilians in a single one. Again, don't fully quote me on that. Please, I might be incorrect on those numbers, but I do know that the devastation from the firebombing campaign was massive on the Japanese cities.
For some setbacks trying to liberate the Netherlands, but they were making progress and were now threatening the industrial heartland of Germany. Hitler's health, both mentally and physically, was rapidly deteriorating. Things were looking bad, and he was desperate.
He was diagnosed with Parkinson's as well.
Just the trick. Remember a few years back when we blitzkrieged through the Ardennes and trapped the Allied forces in Belgium? Well, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Again. He gathered his forces and tried to pound them through the Ardennes. He used up the remaining
damn near
German
succeeded
strength
too.
and resources, and he managed to create quite a nice bulge. He also trapped some American forces in the Belgian town of Bastogne. The Germans sent the trapped Americans a message saying surrender or be annihilated. When it was read out to the commanding officer, he said, "They want to surrender? No, sir, they want us to surrender." Nuts! And that's what they sent off as their official reply. General Patton's Third Army then managed to break the siege from the southwest, and the Germans were pushed back. Hitler's last-ditch attempt had failed, and what followed was a total collapse of the German forces. The Allies pushed into Germany from both...
And notice the Canadians liberating the Netherlands here. So every year, through the anniversary of the liberation of the Netherlands, the government of the Netherlands, they send flowers to the Canadian government every year since the liberation of the Netherlands from Nazi Germany.
Besides, the Soviet Union took Warsaw and kept pushing to Berlin. In his bunker, Hitler realized all hope was lost. Berlin fell, and with it, Hitler's dreams of a great German empire. Two of the Axis nations had been knocked out. One to go.
Great.
The Americans began their assault on Okinawa, the last island before they would reach the Japanese mainland. The desperate Japanese fought hard, launching kamikaze attacks on the U.S. ships. The citizens of Okinawa suffered through the terrible fighting, but in 2 months, the island was captured. The Allies now had to make a choice. Either continue the devastating struggle up the Japanese mainland, or...
And what's interesting is, I don't know if this map is fully accurate, but I mean, look at how far they've still pushed into China, right? Look at how far that is.
It tried to coerce the Japanese into surrendering now. In July, the first successful atomic bomb test took place in New Mexico, and the destructive weapon was ready for use. America and the UK were also seeing the Soviet Union not so much liberating as occupying its captured territories, and so they wanted to put on a show of force. On August 6th,
and that is the ultimate tragedy too. Is let me just go back there for a second. Is that that's a lot of the countries here that were, what would you say, puppeted, occupied, whatever, from the Soviet Union. I mean, especially something like Poland, where Polish troops fought so bravely, not only in the Battle of Britain, where a lot of the pilots, they were Polish, but also through some of the expeditionary forces that they had. It really, really is a shame that countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, right, that were really victims of fascism, then became victims of communism, right? And arguably Hungary as well, through some of the arm twisting that was done. Really they all are victims of fascism, right? But it was really a shame that then they became victims of communism afterwards.
Operating as occupying its captured territories, and so they wanted to put on a show of force. On August 6th, the A-bomb fell on Hiroshima. Then, on the 9th, Nagasaki.
Yeah.
The cities were reduced to rubble, and for the people living there, it was a terrible fate. But for the Allies, it achieved their main aim. In September, the Emperor announced Japan's surrender, saying the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. After 6 years, war was finally over. The Allies occupied Japan for 8 years. The Emperor was allowed to keep his position, but General MacArthur made sure this picture was printed in the Japanese press to display to the Japanese people that their Emperor was not the divine, powerful being they had believed. Germany.
And what's fascinating too is that a lot of Japanese generals and politicians did not see the same level of retribution in terms of war crimes trials that the Germans had, right? And especially and the Italians too, because Italy was really needed as a country to be a bulwark, right, against the communist East, right? With Austria sort of taking a neutral stance, right? Italy was also seen as one of the borders against communism, and so they were more used in that sense. I think it really is a shame that a lot of these war criminals that should have been prosecuted, unfortunately weren't, due to the development of politics with the Cold War. And a lot of these people that are again, arguably, in a court of law, and not just my opinion, but arguably, right, committed war crimes were sort of let go, so to say, due to their skills, their needs, that the Allied countries needed them for.
It was divided between America, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union. In 1949, the Allied sectors were united into West Germany. The Second World War had been more terrible and destructive than the First. In its aftermath, two major superpowers with two very different ideologies had come out victorious, and the tension between the two of them would create a new kind of war. A very, very cold one.
Nice.
Wow, Churchill, that looks just like me.
And fantastic. Yeah, and just a bit of a closing comment on that is that World War II really did transform the 20th century into the American century, right? And with the influence of not only the Cold War, but also the rebuilding. All right, let's just go back to the map here for a second. The rebuilding of Western Europe with the Allies' money, right? Especially with the Marshall Plan. It's really, really fascinating to think of some of the what ifs of what could have happened, and really looking at the war as a whole. So I think these videos were fantastic. I really, really enjoyed watching them. I can see why they're so popular. I mean, I think this one has 48 million views, 40 million views or something. So thank you very much for joining me. Hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, feel free to comment anything, any questions, maybe something I got wrong. Maybe I got some of the facts and figures wrong. Any debates that you guys want to have, or any other videos, join the Discord. The link is in the description, and put it in the suggestions, and I'll be back again on today's Friday, so on Sunday, or sorry, no, Saturday, with a new reaction video. So tomorrow, I will see you guys tomorrow, and yeah, till then, take care.